Well, first I would say that even though this is an extremely religiously hardline president, I still think that Iranians are growing more secular by the day. I write about that in my book because that's how I noticed people were living. I think that what has not happened in most Middle Eastern countries is that religious and Islamic parties and movements have never come to power. So they retain their appeal as a group or a movement or an ideology that can fix poverty, that can fix the situation with Israel and Palestine, that can fix everything that is still going wrong in Middle Eastern countries. But in Iran, we had an Islamic revolution, and the clerics came to power. And they did not do a very impressive job. And so the question is no longer troubling Iranians. They know you have mullahs in power and your country becomes ineffective and a pariah state. And so it's no longer really a mystery. I say the majority of people realize this formula doesn't work. And so even though they may be very traditional and religious in their own daily lives, they don't necessarily think, I would argue, but in the majority, that a theocracy is fit to take Iran into the future. Why then did President Ahmadinejad win this election? Well, first of all, I think I should lay out a few points, which is one, it was not a sweeping mandate. I think in the 2 rounds of voting, in the first round he got a very small number of votes compared to the general population. The population is 70 million. He didn't even get, I think, into the double digits. I could be wrong, but it was not a sweeping mandate. Many, many Iranians didn't vote at all. They just felt very disappointed in the political process. They felt like this is not a process that answers any of our needs. We all voted for this supposedly liberal president 2 terms in a row, and he didn't really change enough, so why should we bother to vote again? So there was definitely a lack of turnout because of apathy and just disappointment in the process and the process of the regime being changed through the system. In the second round of voting, President Ahmadinejad had a great deal of help from the Revolutionary Guards, which are a sort of hardline military body of the government or the regime, with enormous resources at their disposal. They fanned out into the countryside, they recruited voters, and it was very much an election outcome that reflected access of this candidate to the most prosperous and the most hardline institution within the regime. So this was not a sweeping victory. And the reactions to his election, I think, reflected that. I remember going around Tehran after the election and talking to people, and all people had to say was, do you want to hear the latest joke I heard about the president? He was not taken seriously. He was seen as a kind of fringe figure with very folksy religious attitudes. As mayor, he was not popular. He was mayor of Tehran before he was elected president. And he was notorious for things like wanting to have separate elevators for men and women, for being much more concerned with religious ideology and this old sort of dinosaur revolutionary ideology, which no one today was very much interested in. And this carried over into his candidacy as president. So what changed, and I think it's been noticeable for me because I've been there throughout this period, is that as the West increased its pressure on Iran over its nuclear program, the president made a very coherent, strategic effort to cast the nuclear issue as the sovereign right of a proud nation to civilian nuclear power, which under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, any country that has signed up to that treaty is guaranteed that right. It was extremely effective because for the ordinary Iranian, if you simply think about the energy needs of this country, if you think about the security needs of this country as having an alternative energy source, when Iraq on the one side is in violent chaos, devolving by the day, Afghanistan on the other side is unsecured, is still extremely lawless outside Kabul. It is not a safe region, with Pakistan, on the other hand, sort of on verge of military coup, it seems, all the time, with its own nuclear bomb, with Israel, with which Iran has had an antagonistic relationship with its nuclear bomb. The Iranian government very effectively sold to the Iranian population that the state needs to provide for the energy needs of this population in the years to come, and is doing so under the oversight of international inspectors. And Iranians, sort of watching what is going on in the region, especially in the last year or two with Iraq, I think we're very convinced by this. On top of that, I think, despite what I said before about Iran being this last bubble of pro-American sentiment, that's been tarnished somewhat in the last year or two. I think there's still certainly not the anger and the reflexive hostility that exists in the Arab world when it comes to America. A very political anger over Israel and Palestine, over Iraq, because these are Arab countries which respond in a different way, in a different emotional way even, to events in other Arab countries, because it's seen somewhat as a collective Arab world. Iran, being Persian, doesn't have necessarily the same roots and the same grounds for sharing that set of attitudes. So that said, though, the Abu Ghraib scandals, the Guantanamo Bay scandals, the prisoner abuse of Iraqis, on top of that, the way that Iraq gets growingly more violent every day and slides towards civil war, all of this, and on top of that especially, the growingly aggressive American rhetoric towards Iran, I think has combined to make ordinary Iranians feel much more skeptical about American motives in the Middle East and regarding Iran in particular. So when a standoff like this accelerates or grows more alarming and urgent between the U.S. and Iran, I would say that the sense now and the attitudes now are much more inclined to give this hardline president, give him the benefit of the doubt, because what he talks about in his speeches is a strong Iran in a troubled region, is an Iran that is simply standing up for its sovereign rights. It doesn't want anything more than that. And this resonates in Iran, given the security situation in the region, given what it seems the president is asking for, given America's conduct in the region the last 2 years. And so I think that the tide has really shifted, and there is much more, there's actually a real nationalist backing for the president's stand on the nuclear issue. That said, before this really became such a heated issue and began to be such a hot button issue in the international community, most Iranians didn't really have a collective opinion about should we or should we not have a nuclear weapon. It was not something that people thought about on an everyday level. The level of information, I think, inside Iran about this has been insufficient. There's not a real debate about it in newspapers because up until recently, certainly, even the prominent people in the regime were reluctant to really come out and challenge the president on this issue because it had really become an issue of nationalism. And also, at the same time, because the government, of course, doesn't say or admit that what it is pursuing is the capacity to build a weapon, the debate is not even about, there's not a real debate about should we or should we not have a weapon and what are the costs of that. So most people, I think, when it comes to the nuclear issue, don't really have a fully informed context with which to make a decision, to know what the government is really up to and to know what the costs of that are in terms of isolation for Iran, in terms of economic sanctions for Iran.